Welcome to the Undercurrent News podcast series. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Gorjan Nikolik of Rabobank, who is probably one of the industry's most, or probably the most distinguished speaker. And everybody loves to listen to Gorjan for his very global view of the industry. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. You're overselling it, but thanks. No pressure on my side.
Yeah. Good, great. So we were exchanging notes in the week about the main topics, and you sent me some of the bank's latest research. And I'll go through. We'll talk about salmon, shrimp, the fish meal, fish oil side, and even this very interesting insect space. So I guess starting with one of the big topics, and let's get into salmon. What do you make of this year as the food service sector start to come back in North America, Europe? It's a difficult one to call, isn't it? But how are you seeing?
Salmon is always difficult to call, but we're seeing really positive dynamics, right? So on one side, we had a very, very strong quarter. A lot of volume was produced in quarter one. But you saw that even though we started the quarter with low prices, we've now fully recovered. So we've had really a big return of demand. If you can define demand as the volume consumed at a certain price point, we have now a good price point. Really, we are back to, I would say, probably 2019 level. But at a much higher volume. I believe the first quarter was one of the biggest quarters we've ever had. So we're going into the year in a good way. But I think the second part, or maybe let's say the middle part of the year, what's remaining will be different, because this is when we're going to experience the big contraction from Chile. It will be mostly felt in the fresh sector, of course, because they will be releasing some frozen inventory, but there will be some shortages, particularly in North America, maybe in other regions that are supplied by fresh product from Chile, like Brazil, and there is a double-digit decline. And basically, Norway is not able to fully meet this because they had a good growth this year, but most of the growth already happened. For Norway, so the remaining part of the year is quite limited. So I do expect if food service really comes back as it might, we expect quite good pricing and a profitable year for most in 2021.
That's great. So I noticed that I think you put on the in the research that 13% drop from Chile. And I guess that must add in the latest incidents of algae bloom.
Yeah. So it includes that as well. Yeah. So I believe about three quarters to 80% of the drop is still related to the smolt decline, the smolt release decline in 2020. But there is an element of the algae bloom there as well.
Yeah. There's a snapback in you got in 2022 a big snapback in the Chilean supply, coming back 16%. Is it? I think the question I have is, like, do you think these Chilean regulations were designed to sort of stop this roller coaster type scenario each year? Do you think it's
to my knowledge, it's the Chilean regulations don't prevent you from recovering lost ground like this. As long as your biology is fairly good, and again, to my knowledge, I think the biology in Chile is really quite good at the moment. We've experienced really record high harvest yield, so harvest weight basically, and mortality really didn't increase much, which sometimes was expected when you have when you leave the fish a little bit longer in the water. We could have expected that, but we didn't see it. So I would say biology is quite good in Chile.
Right. That's great. What do you make of the Chinese market? Obviously, ever since June last year, when we had this Beijing market incident, the demand seems to have dropped quite drastically. Yeah. And there's some talk of it coming back now.
Yeah, so what I heard as well is that indeed the market had dropped, but it's coming back. It's coming back in a good way, particularly for European exporters really did note that there's quite good demand coming outside of Europe, and that's especially Asia, China, definitely coming back.
Yeah.
So that's also adding to the positive part of the story.
I see. That's great. That's great. And if we move on to the shrimp market, does the shrimp market look similar in terms of food service recovery?
There's some similarities, but then again, the shrimp market is also quite vastly different from salmon, given the very short cycle. So in salmon, we always have some data. We have smolt. We can talk about what's the biomass. In shrimp, there is no biomass to be heard of, right? There's no data for that. And also, the only thing you have is some data on imports of post-larval. So that could give you an indication what will happen in the next few months. So not longer than that. At least that looks quite promising. So it looks like there's going to be growth this year and a recovery. Certainly prices have recovered, and that's similar. The similarity is that, again, the United States is a very good market. Especially shrimp. So it's even more so than in salmon. Shrimp has been a great winner for the US in 2020, really driven by the fact that it is a frozen product. It is the #1 seafood product there. People are very familiar with it. And the low price environment really fostered more demand. So we've basically started the year with that strong demand in 2021. But prices started to go up. So again, there is definitely a parallel there. So more demand, but at a higher price point. And what you see is that some of the same things are still repeating themselves from 2020. India had a lot of issues in 2020 due to COVID. Remember in April and the summer, we had these lockdowns that were put in place very rapidly. People couldn't get juveniles. The processors couldn't get a processing capacity. Again, we have that problems in India. We have processing capacity problems. And again, the beneficiary is Indonesia. That's the other region that can deliver processed product to retail into the United States. So again, you see that. But what's different now is that Ecuador has joined the group of suppliers in the US that's in a big way, right? They have really invested in processing capacity, and they are, I believe, coming to Europe and particularly the United States for good, right? They're really increasing their market share, and I would say not opportunistically, but to stay there. So those are, let's say, the two main countries that are really growing now and doing very well. And I would say certainly Ecuador is really the country to watch when it comes to their capability to quickly pivot from China into US, invest in processing, and still grow at the price level. At the low price levels in 2020, they still kept on growing. They just basically grew a little bit less fast than they would have normally, and they are on such a momentum. Yeah. So yeah, really a country to watch.
The volumes that China was ordering from Ecuador previously, are they just lost volumes, or would you think China would make those up from other suppliers?
So for quite a bit, there were lost volumes, right? So China did import a lot less at the end of 2020, and they're still importing less, but it's coming back. And Ecuador is also coming back to China gradually, but it is less than previously. So that full recovery hasn't yet happened, but they have more than made up the loss of the Chinese business with the gains in the US and Europe. So on the net, Ecuador is still up. They're still growing. And the beneficiary also is Indonesia, like I said, and India is the one that's tough one. They could have benefited here a lot, given that they are the dominant player in the US. They are supplying the best market right now, but they're not really capturing that opportunity as they could have.
I guess, does India get disrupted by COVID this year in your area?
So in the document that I shared with you, no, but we're gonna be updating that soon, in the next couple of days. I'm going to present about shrimp at the North Atlantic Seafood Forum. So I would really like to update my views on India before that. Yeah, I think there are some challenges in India, and also I recently heard that Monodon might be making a comeback in that region with new genetics. So let's see how that plays out in the future. Um, of course, Monodon was a species that lost a lot of ground when India backed out. It also sort of left Bangladesh a bit on their own with Vietnam. And also Vietnam has had some flat to declining, and now Bangladesh is also pulling out of Monodon. So if India comes back to it, I think it would be interesting. But that's maybe a discussion for another call at a later date. But
Sure.
certainly India is a country that they will be keeping an eye on in the next couple of weeks. That I think maybe changing our view, because we had a recovery still in our model, and I might reduce that to flat. But let's see what I gather in the next couple of weeks.
I see. And do you have a view on the cold water shrimp market?
No, I don't follow that. Sorry, it's a bit of a niche species, and no, I don't follow it. So
that's fine. No problem. I just recently participated in a panel of the GAA, and we were talking about, has seafood come out of this pandemic in a new normal where there's greater demand than before? What's your view on that?
I think it really depends on the species. So there are certain core species that really benefited. I think during the pandemic we had a switch towards the familiar. When people switched from food service to food retail, they also went towards the species that they know and know how to cook. There's a lot of let's say more often wild caught, more niche products. People didn't really dare to learn how to cook at home. What they did is that they might have cooked shrimp or salmon or tuna or cod before, and then they just did more of that. Some, of course, learned new recipes and learned how to cook new species, but on the aggregate, I think what was lost more was, let's say, the niche products, and what was gained more is these more commoditized, classical products. The top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in every country. Those are the ones that gained, and the tail became a little bit shorter. If you look at the normal distribution of consumption.
It's been good for salmon and shrimp.
Good for salmon, good for shrimp. Yeah, definitely good for those products. Some of the wild caught products could have benefited, like pollock and cod. I think they didn't, due to the issues that they had from the supply side, but that's different.
Right, that's great. And I noticed that you recently looked at the fish meal and fish oil markets. Always an interesting space. What's going on? Some interesting supply issues. I think you mentioned that especially the first 2 months of this year, there's been very strong fish meal imports into China. So I just wondered what is going on in that market to kind of warrant that.
So I think first of all we should look at the bigger picture, and it's important to note here what kind of situation we have in the agri-proteins and the agri-oils. It's almost a perfect storm. We have a very high fuel costs, which drive cost. We had bad weather in many important regions. North America, we had a La Nina across South America, which brought dry weather. So you had a weak supply and weak yields and high costs. On the other hand, you had tremendous demand. Although COVID, I also forget to mention also some farmers, particularly in the US, during 2020 were a bit bearish about the outlook, so they planted less. So on one side you have this constrained supply, on the other side you have this very bullish demand, with people actually eating as much, if not more, during COVID, with China rebuilding its protein, its pig herd, so consuming more proteins also from imports, and from still the imports are high. They're still rebuilding rebuilding the herd. So soy is expensive, blending requirements are high. So overall, you have this high commodity prices. So what happens then is that fish meal starts to look pretty good. Fish oil starts to look very good in the formula. So looking at the supply side on fish meal and fish oil, we did have a good season in Peru. The one that ended, let's say, late, actually very early 2021. So there was a good supply coming from there. Certainly, it was a lot better than the same season the previous year. So that's why we have that big jump. China came strongly onto that supply because they were basically depleted and had to rebuild their stocks. We just had a couple of weeks ago the announcement of the new quota in Peru, which was I would say kind of a mid level. It was maybe a little bit below what the bullish people were expecting, but it's not a bad quota. So it's kind of a mid level quota. I think it makes the market balance, and certainly there will be demand for this product. And most likely many of the Peruvians would have pre-sold already a lot of the products, but those that didn't, I guess, will get somewhat better prices now. It's just it's interesting. It's a good supply and good demand scenario.
Yeah.
Which is great for the sector, right?
Yeah, right, for sure. And I think you mentioned that when you look at the ASF and the pork industry in China, if I'm not mistaken, Rabobank doesn't really predict a full recovery in that until about 2023 in terms of rebuilding the herd. Yeah. Does that bode well for seafood?
It's very difficult to ascertain exactly the impact of the African swine fever on seafood. I think certainly at the moment, pork prices are still high. Don't forget that we had a bit of a difficult three or 4 months in China. So the winter was difficult. December, January, February. Actually, there was more disease and some herd losses. Nevertheless, the scenario we're still assuming is that by 2021 they will still continue to rebuild the herd, although somewhat slower pace than they did before. But it does mean that the high price of pork is there. That also means what we see now is that beef and lamb and some of the other proteins that are in relatively short supply, but affected by China, they're also quite, at a high price point. So I guess these would benefit seafood. Chicken is benefiting the most. Chicken is the one that's coming in most into China, both poultry, domestically produced and imported. And that's where the supply side is very flexible, right? It's a very elastic supply. So that sector clearly benefits. How much seafood benefits, it's always difficult to say. I would say to a certain extent, but other seafood specific drivers, such as what we saw with the discovery, or well, I guess you could call it discovery of COVID on the outside of the packaging of Ecuadorian shrimp, and the whole story with salmon on the chopping board. Those drivers might even affect seafood more than the very high price environment we are in China. But we do see Chinese aquaculture certainly seeding more this year and feeling bullish. And what I hear from China is that they're very bullish about food service coming back. Because a lot of the Chinese aquaculture industry, particularly marine and higher value, they were actually hurt by food service. So as that comes back, that they will also benefit from that. So it's quite a few different dynamics playing there. Which one would be stronger than the other? It's always hard to say at the end.
Sure. And the oil market, does that? I guess the supply picture is quite similar to fish meal in the sense that the volumes depend on the quotas from especially Peru.
Yeah, it's similar, although it's also slightly different. What I understand is that the supply of fish oil is a bit stronger this year. On the other hand, the demand is also stronger since we have these blending requirements in Brazil and other countries to use more biodiesel, and also it's more profitable given the high oil price. So the general veg oil prices are at highest, at record levels.
Yeah.
And it's actually the oil that's now driving the commodity prices. So on the demand side, it looks good, but also the supply side here is even greater. And then when we look at it specifically for fish oil, remember salmon is a big driver, and salmon has a kind of a flat year this year. So hard to judge. No one has a crystal ball, but I would say that the supply demand balance might be a little softer in the oil side than on the meal side. But I don't. Who knows how we'll end up as the year progresses.
I guess this is a good moment to sort of wade into the alternatives. On the oil side, I think there's been the most adoption of alternatives in the algae oils. What's your take on how these new products are filtering into the salmon market?
Yeah, so far I understand that indeed the algae are the most used of the alternatives, that a significant amount of salmon has already been produced in Norway with some inclusion of algae oil. I understand it's very small, but
yeah,
it's a start. And I would say, let's say the type of companies that are in this sector are the most capitalized and largest players around. There's certainly, if you compare the algae oil producers to the insect producers, it's a very different type of player. There are many insect producers, but they're rather small, and they have attracted good capital, but they are completely different than the large multinational enterprises, the likes of DSM and Corbion, which are listed players that produce algae oils. So that's a bit the difference in their capital availability, and also the penetration of that product has been quite high.
Yeah. Do you think that they're anywhere near to price conversion or even price proximity with fish oil?
No, I don't think they're ever anywhere near it yet. But Matt, I do have another call that started 2 minutes ago, so I'm gonna have to jump.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay. Can I just ask you one more question on insects?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So just on the insect side, I was very interested to see your price predictions on the right now 3,500 euros to 5,500 euros, and I think you see that going down in a maturity phase to 1,500, 2,500, which seems like it's getting a little bit closer to fish meal. What do you think the main challenges are? I guess the feedstock side of things is quite interesting. Like ultimately, what are they feeding so that the OPEX is at an attractive rate?
I mean, the price of insect proteins is a very complex thing to answer, because It depends on a number of things. It first depends on the research that we're going to produce and understand how much, what kind of effect insect proteins have and where will they be used. So it's quite possible that there are some gut health and palatability benefits, and especially for certain species like freshwater species, perhaps eel or sturgeon or others.
Gorjan, I know that you need to take another call. I really thank you for your time. There was some terrific insights there, and I'm delighted that you could join us. Thanks very much.
Bye, Matt.